Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce you to Jennifer Crawford. Many of you would know Jennifer. She's Supplier Audit and Compliance Manager for Coles with, I won't say how many years experience, but a lot of experience, not only here, but in the UK with Tesco and SAI Global. She's driven by passion for the food industry, takes pride in having the greatest team to provide the best second-party audits for Coles' own brand suppliers. One of the reasons for inviting Jennifer is that I know that not only does she, sit in her Coles headquarters, but she's out there looking at sites and following up on sites that have been certified by SQF and other GFSI standards. As an audit and compliance manager, her goals include getting all Coles suppliers to green status, and her ultimate goal is to never again walk into a food factory that doesn't make you wash your hands on entry. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Crawford.
Thanks, Bill. And thanks to SQF for inviting me to present a retailer's perspective on recurring issues found during audits. I do have to sort of say it was really interesting listening to you and Leanne. You're like a double act, which is good, and it's nice to listen to. Leanne, don't worry about not being in Melbourne. It's absolutely teeming down with rain here, and it's to continue for the next 3 days. So when people think of us in Australia and sun, not in Melbourne. Unfortunately, with regard to the topic of our conversation, I know I'm not bringing anything new to the party. And again, listening to Leanne, I think we may be on repeat. And I think I was going to say, most of you maybe heard with the conversation with Martin, we're going to be repeating all the way through this morning, because the issues that I'm going to go through, they're definitely not new. Sadly, most of them are considered fundamental by all of the audit standards, which is disappointing. As Bill said, I'm incredibly passionate about the food industry. I will tell you that I have got more than 30 years experience, but I feel I don't feel that age at all. I find it incredible. I love listening to factories that talk about developing their food safety culture. I love learning about all the incredible new innovations, the new products, new way of doing things. The most recent conference was at recently talked about cellular agriculture, which was, growing your own burgers, which for me was just amazing. The way that we use data analytics, etc. However, while we make these massive steps and progress, the basics still have to be in place. They have to be managed and not forgotten. Interestingly, Leanne talked about the benefits of internal audits, and it's one of the things that I continually, it's a bit of a mantra for myself, where I tell suppliers, the best suppliers that we have at Coles are the suppliers that do the best internal audits, and they don't have the major issues. So it's nice to sort of hear that being repeated elsewhere. Again, anyone that knows me, knows I have great facial expressions. I definitely could not be a poker player. People see me roll my eyes when I hear the common phrases, and again, I'm sure you've all heard it as well, but we've always done it this way. And the two that I was going to say probably shock you, but why do I need to wash my hands? And the final one, which, to be honest with you, I heard this week, was what level of pest infestation is acceptable? And yeah, I did say those last two comments. So in this presentation, I'd like to take you through, what happens when things go wrong, what happens when these issues are raised, what the consequences could be. As a retailer, we require all of our suppliers to hold a GFSI certificate. And then on top of that, we also do our own audits. We have our CFMSR standard, and I've got my own team of auditors. We do this because we have a massive brand. Coles is one of the biggest brands in Australia, and we have to ensure that the customers are happy with all of the products all of the time. the safety and the quality. So the issues highlighted here are just a small selection. I've picked out HACCP, I've picked out labelling, I've picked out hygiene, training, which again Leanne talked about earlier, and the other two that I've added on are traceability and labour. These need much more focus by our suppliers. Leanne talked about pest control earlier, and to be honest, I probably would have had 10 in my list here, but Bill only gave me 30 minutes, so this is what we've got. But before I get into the detail of everything, I would like to, oh, sorry, gone too far. I'd like to talk about the product safety incidents that are a feature of life in Australia. Again, these are some of the stats that Leanne, so again, you know, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. This shows you what happens when things go wrong, but it's interesting to see that what we highlight as repeat offenders in audits also manifest themselves in recalls and withdrawals. So again, as Leanne said earlier on, the food recalls, the undeclared allergens are on the steepest rise. I think it's about 42% of all of the recalls all over the last decade. And this also shows that Australia has one of the highest rates of food allergy in the world. And again, I was quite shocked that we had that we were at or above the number of recalls in the US, the UK and Canada for all industry sectors, which was really concerning. Labelling at Coles, we see this on at least a weekly basis with proprietary brands, and our own brands are not exempt, and I'll kind of come on and I'll show you some of the examples that we've had of that in a little while. Microbial and chemical contaminants and other categories are also rising, but again, as Leanne said, interesting and good to see that foreign matter was on a decreasing trend. I think as well, many food businesses do a fantastic job in controlling issues that might result in recalls. However, there's still a lot that don't. And when you have recalls in any sectors, this then undermines the public trust in that product. So, you know, again, you've got to think of our issues where we had 4-leaf salad from one grower that affected the whole of Australia and the whole of the industry. We talk about melons in the last couple of years, where again, you know, it was from one supplier, but it affected the melon industry as a whole. So, you know, you've got to think of all of these things. It's not just you, just because you do it right. You've got to look at it, what everybody else is doing as well. So first on the agenda is HACCP. Oh, sorry, guys. Knew it would be better if somebody else did this for me. So HACCP, again, we've got to look back. We're 60 years on, 60 years into HACCP. You know, it was developed in the 60s, implemented in the kind of sort of the 80s and the 90s. But, and as again Leanne said earlier, this is our top issue for non-conformances. HACCP's the most effective and it's the most rational means of assuring food safety from farm to fork, and it prevents problems from happening. Our non-conformances show that in some cases HACCP training is not carried out. Training is going to be a feature of this, this half hour. CCPs are not managed and that prerequisites are not controlled. Examples include again, things like we've had, and these are all recent things that happen, divert checks that are not being carried out on a dairy plant that's pasteurising milk. Again, this is a CCP, and it happens more frequently than we would, it happens. And prerequisites, again, you know, feels like 100 years ago when I sort of started in the food industry, we talked about glass audits, and you know, in the last sort of month, we were in a site that didn't have a glass breakage procedure. And then just this week, well, again, alluding back to my earlier comment, we had an issue on site where production was stopped due to pest infestation. Now, if that site had had the prerequisites programs in place, pest control, if they were managing it, then, you know, again, we'll kind of sort of come on to the other things that have happened. But having a properly managed HACCP system in place will save companies money. And I've got to apologise for the background noise. I think I'm the only person in the world who comes out of lockdown and buys a puppy. So that's the noise that you're hearing in the background, by the way. So these are some of the examples of our recalls where HACCP plans needed updating due to known or emerging risks. These were some of the recalls that we've had in the last 2 years. Wrong labelling, which has resulted in an undeclared allergen. So this was the Thai green curry soup. And just this morning, for example, I've seen that Tesco in the UK have recalled their green Thai style sauce due to the presence of milk, which hadn't been declared on the label. The one thing that I would say with here is that we have very few companies that have labelling as a CCP. And when you're talking allergens, I don't see where you're justifying that as not being a CCP. Earlier this year, we had Tasmanian smoked salmon, which should have been a use by, but the operator thought it was a frozen product and put a best before on. So again, that ended up in a recall. Last year we had the challenge, and I think again a lot of companies did, with the cashew cross-contamination with peanuts. Again, it was a known issue. It was something that, you know, any companies that were using cashews, if they had been doing the horizon scanning properly, they would have sort of seen that. And again, rechecking sort of approved suppliers as part of your prerequisite programme might have helped. And then the salmonella in raw onions, again, it hasn't directly affected us in Australia. However, we need to all be doing this horizon scanning. We need to understand what's going on in the rest of the world so that we can be prepared or manage expectations to understand why this wouldn't affect us, so that we can be prepared for it. The raw onions one was an interesting one, just because we have, again, and I don't know how many of you are in WA, but it's a thing in WA where the outer of the onions have to be peeled and put on display, and all of the retailers do this. So at Coles, we had to review the processing, the transportation and the storage and the display for peeled onions to ensure effective sanitising and temperature control, etc. And then, interestingly, we were talking earlier this week, and Claire had sort of said that there was another recall in Canada just last week for exactly the same issues. So it's it's challenging. And I think, again, just please be aware of what's going on in your industry. It keeps you on top of any emerging issues before it could happen to you. And again, I think my tagline for the next 20 minutes is going to be, it could save you money. Next on the agenda is labelling. And again, on a weekly basis, we have issues with labelling where suppliers put a wrong date or a wrong product, or where we have illegible date codes on products that end up causing product withdrawals. We have very prescriptive requirements for our own brand suppliers, where we talk about hourly checks and recording checks and making sure that you've got copies of this check, because this issue just doesn't seem to go away. We encourage suppliers to use vision systems when mistakes have happened. However, these are not infallible because a human still needs to enter the correct information. For those of you that are beady-eyed, you'll see that these are not actually grape tomatoes, they're cherry tomatoes. Sorry, guys. And yes, that is a spanner in the works, or should I say the carrots. And this was picked up by a team member in one of our stores before a customer saw it. Issues that we see routinely are labels not being stored correctly, not being put away, old labels left on a line, checks not being carried out to verify dates on packs, or correct weights on packs, or even the wrong product. In the last 8 years, I've seen lemons being labelled as limes at least 3 times. And quite often we get the blame because our labels are similar, which again is a challenge. So ensuring labelling checks are in place and managed effectively reduces mistakes and costly withdrawal exercise, which saves companies money. So now on to my dirty pictures. Hygiene, hygiene is my favourite. And although a lot of you will laugh at this, I genuinely had aspirations of one day being a cleaner. I love clean, but look where I've ended up. When I was younger and working in factories, I took great satisfaction in seeing whole cleaning processes, especially in places like, and again, for the vegetarians in the room, I'm really sorry, but in an abattoir where at the end of the day, all you see is pools of blood and guts and the smell. But then seeing a cleaning crew come in, seeing equipment all stripped down, getting into all the, again, excuse the Scottish term, they're getting into the nooks and the crannies, seeing the foaming of chills and the end result with spotless surfaces and gleaming equipment that's sanitised and ready to go again for the next day just really gave me a buzz. Weird, I know, but that was my thing. If your factory's not effectively clean, you risk workers being unable to find the materials they need. It leads to increased errors, which in turn lead to increased waste and costs and slower turnarounds in production. And this sort of environment is also likely to be more stressful to your staff, potentially creating disharmony in the workplace. One of the areas that I always will look is staff facilities. And if staff facilities are not clean, then it would lead me to believe the rest of the factory is not clean. The pictures that you see are from a factory just a few weeks ago, before production was due to start up. I don't have the poll in place that that the guys did, but can you see any challenges with these? At Coles, one of the key differentiators is that with our audits, we'll go on site specifically to see pre-ops. So again, if factories are doing pre-ops, have done cleaning and pre-op is at 2 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning, my auditors will be there. The factories know that we're coming. This is not a surprise visit. This wasn't a surprise visit either. I do see very few dedicated hygiene managers, but if you have one and if they're good, value them because they are worth their weight in gold. Having a good hygiene team and production that allows the proper amount of time for hygiene to occur, which we know has been hard recently, but it's an absolute must. I think, you know, the last couple of years, things have sort of turned on their head with COVID, and we've had some massive escalations in production because we can't go to restaurants, etc. But this has resulted in reduced opportunities for cleaning. However, again, I don't know how to stress it enough. Companies have to realise what their capacity is with that built-in cleaning window. That built-in cleaning window is not extra production time. Companies just seem to be chasing the dollar. So dirty factories lead to problems, and you might be up on the money 1 minute and out of business the next. I don't think it's worth it. I think we talked about poisoning associated with a dairy product occurred in the States when we had ice cream that caused salmonella. I think it was over 200,000 cases, but the outbreak was traced to a milk premix to the ice cream plant, and then its previous load had been raw egg pulp and it hadn't been cleaned. instances is that even possible. Cleaners need to have written plans plus training on how to carry out and have sufficient time for the job, and especially on equipment that have long run times. And I'm sorry, I've gone on about that one a little bit more, but as I say, it is my favourite subject. In our standard within Coles, we specifically talk about string mops not being allowed. And again, this is us being very prescriptive, because one of the major customer complaints that we've had over the years is string in mops. And again, I think you can sort of see from this picture here that we have bits of string hanging down. So again, whether it's a Coles specific clause in the standard, I would expect any auditor from any sort of standard to look at that and see that that is a foreign body potential. Again, I was going to say a little bit of a funny story here, where we had gone back to a site where we'd had a string found in product that had come from a mop, and the technical manager once told me that the string couldn't possibly have come from one of his mops, as the metal detector would have alarmed. I'll leave you to think about that one. Some of the non-conformance examples that we see routinely raised are really around the number of areas within the high were unclean. Equipment was assembled at pre-op, which didn't facilitate inspection, so you couldn't sort of check it. And then cleaning procedure specified daily removal of the belts, but this is not evident from the debris left underneath. So yeah, again, we do look. I think training, Leanne talked about earlier on, and again, it's that whole culture piece. It's that sort of that circle that we've got here. That if we don't have operators on site that are trained, then our productivity goes down, our efficiency goes down, and we make more mistakes. It's one of the biggest areas where we see gaps, and it's just, again, back to what Bill said, there is massive opportunities here. In the majority of audits where non-conformances are raised, training is routinely also raised. So that in itself highlights deficiencies. I also have very few companies who have majors or criticals raised where they come to us and ask what training material is available to support them. And from what Leanne said earlier, maybe that's something that we could work on with, if you have a major raised in a particular section, then part of the corrective action would be to sort of show that you've done formal training, if possible. It's just maybe something that we should consider it. Our food safety laws require businesses to provide food handlers with an understanding of food safety, and this enables them to minimise contamination when handling food products. These good practices will prevent food poisoning and allergic reactions, and it helps minimise food waste, boost efficiency, increase productivity, reduce mistakes, and guess what? Makes you more money. Traceability is another one that we really sort of struggle with. Again, with Coles, with products where we have claims, despite the sort of legal requirements where it's one up, one back, this is not acceptable for Coles from the point of view that if we are talking about claims, we have to sort of be able to go back to farm. So, if we're talking about the salami, the pork that we use within the salami is sow stall free, then we have to trace it back to farm. If the tomatoes are Italian, then again, we have to trace them back to Italy and back to farm. And the same with the flour and the same with the cheese. Traceability helps to keep track of the food in the supply chain, which supports accurate withdrawal and recall of unsafe foods if required. The more information you keep, the easier and quicker it is to identify the affected food, mitigate the risks to consumers, and save time and, that word again, money. I think For us, it has three main benefits. We've got visibility of our supply chain. It improves quality control system and reduces risk. Again, as I said earlier, we must be able to sort of validate our claims. We cannot label something and it not be accurate. Our product specifications are king, and we require companies to document who raw material suppliers are and where they come from. We're not doing it to be nosy. I can assure you we've got a legal requirement to ensure the information that we put on labels is correct. A few years ago, we had to withdraw a product which stated on the label that the coconut milk was from Thailand. And then when we checked during the audit, it turned out that the coconut milk was from Malaysia. So the product was withdrawn as the label was incorrect. And again, interestingly, I can remember the technical manager saying, but it's the same region, so what does it matter? The common issues that we find in traceability is, again, the lack of paperwork. One of my auditors has this saying where she talks about traceability is like a dance, so you go hand to hand. And I always love visualising that. We have challenges with open products not being identified. And companies assuming that labels are correct. For example, if the box says that it's HGP-free beef inside, they don't go back and confirm with the supplier even once, which again is something that we encourage suppliers to do. This section is probably not something that's routinely covered as food auditors on a factory floor. However, it is something that I do want to make you all aware of because COVID has impacted our food businesses worldwide, from factory shutdowns, from reduced availability of certain lines and increasing demands and production of other commodities. We'll not mention toilet roll in this, well, we have done already. But factories are having to manage people, and therefore we're getting more unskilled workers being used, training's not being available, and again resulting in mistakes, shortcuts, health and safety issues. Our food auditors can't walk past these issues if they see them, and I genuinely hope that you guys wouldn't either. These, like the cleaning pictures before, these are all recent pictures taken in Australia. These pictures are of blocked fire escapes, broken lights, damaged emergency exit signs. I do have to repeat, this is not unusual to see this. In a factory a couple of years ago, we were having a look at fire exits, and we asked to see what was on the outside of a fire exit, and I asked the gentleman to open the door. There was then a 2-metre drop to the ground. So again, it wasn't a fire exit I was going to be able to use, but I'm not quite sure he understood the purpose of what a fire exit was. Again, if you see things like this, please speak out. People's safety is paramount. We don't want a repeat of the Bangladesh factory fire, which killed over 100 people in 2012. So the next steps for me, and I'm hoping I'm not going over time, I know that Bill will cut me off if we do, but please create great HACCPs that your team understand and that and are proud of, and the whole factory is aware of. Check and recheck labels. Clean your factory. Give your employees somewhere to be proud of. Train your employees and keep on training them. Understand your traceability and your supply chain inside out. Horizon scan, know what's happening in the world which could potentially affect you. And finally, I don't want to steal Claire's thunder coming up, but create a food safety culture and you'll not go wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. There are a couple of questions that have come through. Sarah Leach is asking how you look after your well-being and the well-being of your team when you're out on audit.
That's a really, really good question. I think it's one of those things that, I mean, obviously we've been doing remote audits, and we are all in a situation just now where we are having to be double vaxxed. So all of the team has happily undertaken that. And again, I am very, very much with the sort of team where, you know, they're on site for 2 days. If they start an audit at 2 in the morning, then they're finishing at sort of 10 or 11. So, you know, I don't want them to work overtime at all. And that's the way that they work. And most of them manage to get things done in the right time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. I think it does. And probably, you know, even more so at the time, you know, during the pandemic and lockdowns, etc. Leanne's also asked, and it's more to do with labour on site. Are you seeing issues with the use of PPE from COVID? Concerns, I guess, on the use of PPE from COVID, such as masks, hand sanitizers, etc.
So again, we've gone down the route of stating with masks, because I have had, we were in a factory probably in July where I was on the line, and a young lady had a glittery mask, which was very pretty. Not for the food industry. So again, we have mandated that masks are issued by sites and that they're not brought from home, so that again we can kind of sort of control, you know, how often they're cleaned, etc., and changed. So that's probably the sort of the key one. Around anything else, it's pretty standard.
Just to finish off, I guess I've got a question as well. You mentioned at the beginning, and Leanne sort of touched on it before as well, that the basics have to be managed, and we're still talking the basics after, well, you indicated 30 years. I've probably got 40 years. Leanne's got, you know, a long period of time as well. No doubt Martin, Claire have got the same, but we're still talking about the basics, you know, 30 years on. That must be frustrating.
It is incredibly frustrating, because I think it's, you know, what do we do? How do we get it through? I think, you know, with training, I seem to sort of drop in, and we've done enough training this month, so that's enough. And I think companies really need to kind of sort of get on board and understand that again, that's a fundamental, that, you know, you need to keep training people, that you need to keep going with it.
Yeah, it's seen by law just as an expense. It's something, you know, it's going to take people off the shop floor. It's, you know, do we really need it, etc. Yeah. Yeah,
and unfortunately, I think we sort of see that with a lot of things. So, you know, your good technical people are seen as an expense. They don't add value, as in they don't add the dollar. Your hygiene team do the same. You know, they cost companies money, and as does training, but they don't see the, you know, the outcome where you have got, you know, wonderful